You abandoned those cubs to die. Humans rescued them and made them stronger. The beacon was not a distress signal. That was the first thing I noted in my log. Distress signals have a rhythm to them. They pulse, they repeat, they carry an urgency that even a machine cannot fake. This one was flat, steady, a single tone broadcasting on a compact emergency frequency, coming from deep inside the Caith expanse, where nothing was supposed to be broadcasting anything at all. I had been awake for 19 straight hours when it came through on my console, and for a long moment, I just stared at it. Selim 7, this is Rescue Unit 4, I said into the comm. We are diverting to investigate an unregistered signal at grid reference 77 Alpha 9. Logging the time as 0312. Voss speaking. My co-pilot, Dex Harlow, looked over from a navigation seat without saying a word. He had been flying with me for 3 years. He knew my voice well enough to hear what I was not saying out loud. We came out of the debris field 22 minutes later, and what we saw stopped us both cold. It was a creche pod. I recognized the design immediately from my xenobiology training. A Vorkai emergency life preservation unit, roughly 4 meters long, built from a dark metal alloy that the compact had no proper name for. It was drifting, rotating slowly on its longest axis. The beacon was coming from a small transmitter mounted on the exterior, and it was the only thing on that pod that was still working correctly. The outer hull had deep scoring along the left side, not from debris impact, but from deliberate jettisoning. The release clamps had been blown outward. Someone had fired that pod away from a ship in a hurry, and they had not looked back. That is a Vorkai creche unit, Dex said. Yes. What is it doing out here? I do not know yet, I said. Bring us alongside. The Vorkai are one of the oldest spacefaring species in the compact. 6 limbs. Dense, scaled hides in colors that range from deep bronze to near black. Crest feathers along the skull and upper spine that change position based on emotion. A biological fact the Vorkai themselves consider embarrassing to discuss. They are proud, hierarchical, and built around a warrior caste system that has not changed meaningfully in 600 years. I had studied them for 4 years before my first posting. I respected them the way you respect a very old, very sharp knife, carefully and with full awareness of what it was designed to do. I pulled up the pod's exterior data panel while Dex held our position. The panel was partially damaged, but readable. I went through the logs one line at a time, and when I reached the entry I was looking for, I stopped. I read it again. Then I read it a third time because I was certain I had made an error somewhere. I had not made an error. The entry read, Biological units assessed. Growth metrics below combat viability threshold. Units classified as non-recoverable weight. Kreshpot Vessel continuing primary mission. Log closed. I sat with that for a moment. The words were clean and precise. There was no distress in them. No apology. No hosetastion. Just a calculation made and an action taken. The same way you might record a fuel expenditure or a course correction. Mara. Dex's voice was quiet. What does it say? It says there are cubs in there, I said. And it says the ship left them. He did not respond immediately. I heard him exhale slowly through his nose. How many? He asked. 6. I suited up in 4 minutes. I had done enough emergency retrievals to move fast without moving sloppy, and my hand was steady as I cycled through the airlock. The pod was cold to the touch when I reached it. Not dangerously so, but cold enough to tell me the internal heating had been running on reserve power for longer than the pod was designed to sustain. I found the manual override panel on the underside, exactly where the schematic said it would be, and I cracked it open. The hiss of equalizing pressure was loud in my helmet. Then the interior lights came on, dim, amber, flickering at the edges, and I saw them. 6 Vorkai cubs, none of them older than what I estimated to be 8 standard months. They were in individual sleep cradles, each one sealed in a shallow, cold sleep suspension that had kept them alive and barely conscious while the pod drifted in silence through a debris field in the middle of nowhere. They were small. Even accounting for their age, they were small. 2 of them had visible injuries, a deep cut along the foreleg of the one in Cradle 3, and something wrong with the spine of the one in Cradle 5, a curve that should not have been there. All 6 were thin in a way that told me the pod's nutrition dispensers had been running below capacity for some time. I stood there and looked at them for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. Then I reached in and I very carefully picked up the smallest one, the one in Cradle 6. She was so light. Her crest feathers were pressed flat against her skull in the way young cubs hold them when they are deeply asleep and trying to be invisible. Her 6 limbs were curled tight against her body. I held her in both arms the way you hold something fragile, and she shifted slightly at the warmth of my suit, and without waking up she reached out with her 4 front claws and closed them around my thumb. She held on, even unconscious, even after being abandoned in the dark. She held on. "Dex," I said into the comm. "Yeah, we are taking them." He did not argue. He did not ask questions. He said, "I will prep the medical bay," and that was that. We worked for the next hour, transferring the cubs one by one from the creche pod into the ship's medical bay. I documented everything as I went, every measurement, every injury, every anomaly. The one in Cradle 3 needed the cut on his foreleg cleaned and sealed before it became a problem. The one in Cradle 5 needed imaging because whatever was happening with that spine had to be assessed before I could know how serious it was. The other 4 were underweight but intact. All 6 were alive. That was the thing that kept hitting me as I worked. They were alive. The pod had been drifting for an estimated 41 hours based on the log timestamps and the debris field trajectory. 41 hours in the cold, in the dark, on a beacon no one was supposed to answer. And all 6 of them were still breathing. I filed my report to Selam, 7 Command, while Dex plotted the return course. I kept the language factual. I gave the grid reference, the beacon details, the pod identification number, the condition of the cubs, and the actions I had taken. I noted that the originating vessel appeared to be a Vorkai colony transport, registry unknown, and that the cubs had been deliberately separated from that vessel per the pod's own recorded log. The response from Selam. 7 came back in 12 minutes. Commander Pell Adler's voice, flat and careful. "Understood, Voss. What is your recommendation?" "Medical evaluation and stabilization on return," I said. "Then we figure out the rest." "The compact is going to have questions," he said. "I know," I said. There was a pause. "Good work," Adler said and signed off. I went back to the medical bay. The cubs were warming up slowly. The 2 injured ones were still in induced sleep. The other 4 were beginning to stir. Small movements, the shifting of limbs, the slight rise and fall of crest feathers as unconsciousness started to release its hold on them. I sat down on the bench along the far wall and watched them. I called the smallest 1/6. It was not a real name. It was just what I had, and she had responded to warmth, and she had held on when there was no reason left to hold on, and that seemed like something worth keeping track of. The others would get numbers too, until they were awake enough to give me something better. Dex came in and stood beside me. He looked at all 6 of them for a long moment. Then he said, "The ship that left them, do you think they knew the pod's beacon was still active?" "Yes," I said. "And they left anyway?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of people do that?" I thought about the log entry. The clean, precise language. The absence of any word that sounded like doubt. I thought about the phrase, non-recoverable weight, and what it meant to measure a living creature in those terms. "The kind who decided a long time ago what is worth saving," I said, and stopped asking the question after that. Dex did not say anything else. He just sat down beside me, and we both watched the cubs breathe in the amber light of the medical bay, and the ship carried us home through the dark. 6 months later, I could tell you exactly how much food it took to bring a malnourished Vorkai cub from the edge of starvation back to a weight that did not make a medical scanner alarm every time you ran a reading. I could tell you the precise temperature a Vorkai cub needs to sleep without stress, warmer than humans find comfortable, cooler than most station quarters are set by default. I could tell you that their crest feathers are a more reliable indicator of pain than any verbal signal they will give you. Because even at 8 months old, Vorkai cubs have already begun to learn that showing pain is not something their culture rewards. I had learned most of this the hard way, by making mistakes and then correcting them, which is the only real way I have ever learned anything. The medical bay at Sealam, 7 had been repurposed within the first week. Dr. Owen Carr, the station's chief medical officer, had taken one look at the Cubs, at their charts, and at me, and had simply said, "Right, we are going to need more space." He was a quiet man from Aberdeen who had spent 15 years in frontier medicine and had the specific kind of calm that only came from having seen a great many things that should not have survived and then watching them survive anyway. He became indispensable within 48 hours. I do not think either of us slept more than 4 hours a night for the first 2 weeks. The compact bureaucracy, as predicted, had questions. The first formal inquiry came in the form of a 3-page document from the Compact Biological Registry, which wanted to classify the Cubs as undomiciled non-citizen fauna, pending species custodianship review. I read that document twice in the same way I had read the Creche Pod log, looking for the error, not finding one. Then I sent a response so precisely factual and so thoroughly sourced with medical data that it took the registry 41 days to figure out how to reply, at which point they sent a shorter document that said, in effect, that the matter was being passed to a subcommittee. I accepted this as a partial victory and kept working. The Cubs had names by the 3rd week. Not the numbers I had given them, real names, or the closest thing to real names that 6 Vorkai Cubs who had not yet developed full language could communicate. The naming happened differently for each of them. The one I had called Third, the one with the spinal curvature, made a specific low sound whenever he wanted to be picked up, and Owen started calling him Kerr because the sound was close to that, and it stuck. The smallest one, 6th, started responding to the name I'd already given her, though I said it so often while treating her that she may simply have learned it the way any creature learns the word that signals attention and warmth. I settled on 6 eventually because it was faster, and she tilted her crest feathers forward whenever I said it, which I took as acceptance. The other 4 named themselves in their own ways over the following weeks. First was called Run, because she had a habit of pressing her forehead against whatever was nearest when she slept: walls, equipment cases, other Cubs. Second became Galt, for reasons that originated with Dex, and that I never fully got out of him. Fourth was Ren. Fifth, the oldest, and already the largest despite his early malnourishment, chose his own name with a kind of deliberate gravity that made everyone on the medical team laugh. He responded only to the sound core, which he had apparently heard Owen use as a measurement unit and had decided was a suitable sound for a Vorkai to answer to. The physical recovery was slow. It was also at times astonishing. Kerr was the one I worried about most. The spinal curvature was significant, a developmental abnormality that Owen identified as arising from nutritional deficiency in the embryonic stage, compounded by inadequate positioning support in the creche cradle during early development. In standard Vorkai medical practice, the condition was flagged for termination at diagnostic stage because a warrior caste does not have resources for long-term mobility cases. Owen and I discussed this for exactly one evening, agreed that we did not operate under standard Vorkai medical practice, and began designing a treatment program. It involved a combination of targeted physical therapy, a custom-built support harness that our station mechanic, a broad-shouldered man named Cal Briggs, who had previously devoted his engineering skills exclusively to keeping our docking systems functional, constructed from materials he sourced with a creativity I had not known he possessed. It involved dietary adjustments that Owen calibrated over 4 separate weeks of incremental changes. It involved daily exercises that Kerr initially resisted with tremendous determination, until the morning he realized the exercises were making him stronger, at which point he began demanding them. Cal built climbing structures. He started with something small and simple, a low frame with 3 levels, designed for the Cubs to practice controlled movement. And within 2 months, he had expanded it into something that took up most of the repurposed cargo bay we had claimed as a secondary habitat space. He did it without being asked. He came in on his days off. He learned enough about Vorkai musculoskeletal development to argue with Owen about optimal incline angles, which Owen found annoying and I found deeply reassuring. Our cook, Nina Aldred, learned Vorkai nutritional chemistry. This is not a small thing. Vorkai dietary needs are significantly different from human ones, and the intersection of what is nutritionally appropriate for a developing Vorkai cub and what could actually be synthesized or sourced on a frontier station required Nina to rebuild her entire preparation process from the ground up. She did it methodically, testing each formulation, noting the cub's responses, adjusting. She kept a separate logbook. She did not ask for thanks or acknowledgement. She just kept making the food better. A retired soldier named Pete Crane, who had come to Selim 7 on a logistics contract and stayed because he had nowhere else in particular to be, began working with the 3 older cubs on strength conditioning. He had spent 22 years in frontier defense forces and knew more about physical training than anyone else on the station. He and Core in particular developed an odd, silent respect for each other. Core watching Pete demonstrate an exercise with the focused, unblinking attention of a creature that was memorizing every detail, Pete pretending not to notice while clearly noticing very much. 6 months in, I wrote up the cumulative data in my evening log. I listed the numbers because that is what I do. I listed weight gains, height measurements, neurological development scores, mobility assessments. I noted that Kerr's spinal curvature had reduced by 31% under the treatment program, and that his mobility rating had moved from severely compromised to moderately restricted, with a projected trajectory toward functional independence. I noted that all 6 cubs had exceeded the compact standard developmental benchmarks for Vorkai cubs of their age group. Not by a small margin, but by a margin that required me to double-check my reference data, because I thought at first I had the wrong age listed. They were not behind. They were ahead. I sat with that for a moment, the same way I had sat with the Creche Pod log 6 months earlier. Then I wrote it down plainly and closed the entry. The Vorkai trade attaché visited Selim 7 in the 5th month. His name was Heron Vach, and he was passing through on what was described as a standard diplomatic route inspection. He was tall even for a Vorkai, with dark bronze scales and crest feathers held in the upright and rigid position that I had come to recognize as meaning controlled contempt. He had been briefed on the cubs before he arrived. I could tell by the way he walked into the habitat bay, not surprised by what he saw, but performing surprise, which is different. He watched the cubs for a while. Core was working through a conditioning routine with Pete. 6 was reading. She had developed an interest in pattern recognition exercises, which had led naturally to an interest in data displays, which had led to Owen quietly introducing her to reading materials when no one was officially supposed to be making educational decisions yet. Kerr was doing his mobility exercises on the climbing frame, pulling himself between levels with a focus that made Heron Vach go very still in a way I watched carefully. "These are the units from the Caith Expanse incident," Heron said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. "They were classified as non-viable at the time of jettison. That is what the pod log says." He turned to look at me. His crest feathers shifted a small movement downward and slightly forward. In Vorkai body language, it was the equivalent of a very subtle frown. "You have expended significant station resources on their development." "Yes." "What is the strategic rationale?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the habitat bay, at Cal's climbing frame, at Pete and Core going through their routine, at 6 with her reading display, at Owen crouched beside Kerr and talking him through the next movement sequence, at Ren and Galt and Ren chasing each other across the upper level of the structure with the specific joyful recklessness of creatures who had recently discovered what their bodies were capable of. "We are getting results," I said. Heron looked back at the cubs. His crest feathers did not move for a long time. "They should not be performing at this level," he said. "The developmental projections for units with their early deficiency profiles would not suggest this outcome." "No," I said. "They would not." He turned back to me. I waited. There was something working behind his eyes, a recalculation, I thought. Something being reconsidered and not yet resolved. "What did you do?" he asked. It was a genuine question. That was the part that caught me off guard. Not the contempt or the strategic framing, but the genuine, unguarded curiosity underneath it. "We refused to accept that there was a ceiling," I said. "We found the problem. We solved the problem. Then we found the next problem and solved that one too. We did that every day for 6 months." He did not respond immediately. His crest feathers were very still. "That is not efficient," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "It is not." He left the next morning. He filed a report with the Vorkai Clan Council, a copy of which I received through back channels 3 weeks later. It described the cub's development as anomalous and inconsistent with projected outcomes. It recommended further observation. It did not recommend retrieval. Not yet. The month cur walked unassisted for the first time. We were in the habitat bay for an afternoon session. Owen had been working with him for weeks on a specific movement pattern, a sequence designed to engage the corrected muscle pathways in a way that gradually reduced his reliance on the support harness. We had tried it 7 times over the preceding 10 days. Each time, Kerr had made it 3 or 4 steps before the harness had to catch him. This time, he made it across the full width of the bay. 11 meters. Unassisted. He stopped at the far wall and turned around. His crest feathers were straight up, a position I had learned meant something between pride and disbelief. He looked at Owen. He looked at me. Then he looked at the other 5 cubs, who had all stopped what they were doing to watch. Nobody said anything for a moment. The cheer, when it came, was entirely human. The cubs did not cheer. They made the low, rapid crest flutter that I had come to understand as Vorkai for something close to fierce approval. Galt crossed the room and pushed his forehead against Kerr's shoulder, which was apparently the Vorkai equivalent of a hug. Kor sat down on the floor with his arms folded and nodded once, very slowly, in the way that Pete had apparently taught him. I wrote it in the log that evening. I used the same clinical language I always used. I noted the distance, the number of steps, the harness readings, the absence of compensatory movement patterns that would have indicated strain. I noted it as a successful outcome of the treatment protocol. Then I put the tablet down and sat alone in the medical bay for a while. I was not sure what I felt exactly. It was not the clean satisfaction of a solved problem. It was something larger and harder to name. Something that had to do with the creche pod log and the phrase non-recoverable weight and the fact that Kerr had just walked 11 meters on legs that had been written off before he ever took his first breath. I sat with it until it settled. Then I picked up the tablet and started planning the next session. 2 years after we pulled that creche pod out of the Caith Expanse, I stopped being surprised by what the 6 of them could do and started being surprised by what they were becoming. There is a difference. Being surprised by performance is a matter of data. You see numbers that exceed your model, you update the model, you move on. Being surprised by what a person is becoming is something else entirely. It does not fit neatly in a log. It does not resolve cleanly into an updated projection. It sits with you, and you find yourself watching, and sometimes you catch yourself thinking things you're not entirely sure how to classify. 6 had started keeping a journal. She had not asked permission. She had simply observed that I wrote in mine every evening, and she had obtained a tablet from the station supply stock. I later learned she had traded Galt 2 weeks of climbing structure priority access in exchange for him getting it from supplies, which told me a great deal about the negotiating skills she had been developing, and she had begun recording things. I did not read it. She had not asked me to read it, and she had not hidden it. And so I understood it as a private thing that she was choosing to exist near me, which felt like trust, and I did not want to do anything to disturb that. What I did see, because she sometimes read sections aloud in the evenings when the 6 of them gathered in the common space, was that she wrote in simple, precise language. She noted things she observed. She noted questions she did not yet have answers to. She wrote down the names of things she was learning and what they connected to in her understanding. Once, she read a passage aloud that described the station, its corridors and its sounds, and the way the light changed in the habitat bay at different hours. And the passage was so accurate and so particular that Owen looked at me across the room with an expression I will not easily forget. She was reading in 3 human languages by month 20. She had started with pattern recognition as a game, the way any cub will, and then somewhere along the way the game had become something else. She did not make a performance of it. She simply read and learned and kept reading. Core becomes something that Pete described, with visible and unconcealed pride, as a natural. What he meant was that Core had an instinctive understanding of physical structure, of how bodies moved, of where effort should be directed and where it was being wasted, of the difference between strength that was built correctly and strength that was compensating for something else. Pete had started their work as a trainer. 2 years later, they trained together, which Pete said with a casualness that fooled nobody. Galt was the one who had surprised me the most, in the specific way that the quietest person in any room often surprises you when you finally pay close enough attention. He did not talk much. He observed. He had a habit of positioning himself near the edges of any activity, watching the whole of it rather than participating in any one part. And what I had initially read as detachment, I had come to understand as something more like deep processing. He noticed things. He remembered them exactly. 3 months earlier, he had walked into the medical bay during a diagnostic session Owen was running on Rin and had pointed to a readout that Owen had been about to move past and said, quietly, that the number looked different from last time. He was right. Owen had nearly missed it. Rin was warm in a way that was distinctly unusual for Vorkai cubs, who are not a species naturally inclined to what humans would call warmth. She had developed the habit of bringing things to station crew members who seemed tired or low, small items, found objects, things she had made from scrap materials in the habitat bay. She never explained them. She would simply place the object near the person and then go back to whatever she had been doing. Cal had an entire shelf of her creations in his workshop. He acted like this was normal. I noticed he had never moved a single one. Ren had Owen's interest most consistently because Ren had begun asking medical questions, not simple ones. Ren wanted to know why the spinal treatment had worked and what the mechanism was, and whether it would work differently in an adult, and what the outer limits of the treatment's applicability were. Owen answered every question with the same seriousness he would bring to a colleague's question, because he had learned early that Rin would notice immediately if she was being managed down to a simpler level and would not forgive it. And Kerr, who had walked 11 meters across the habitat bay 8 months ago, was now walking everywhere, with a gait that still had a particular quality to it, a deliberateness that you noticed if you knew what it had taken to get here, and that was entirely his own. He did not move the way of Vorkai, who had never had the condition moved. He moved the way Kerr moved, which was its own thing. The 6 of them together were something none of us had a word for. They were not fully Vorkai. They were not human. They carried both in ways that were visible if you knew what to look for. The Vorkai precision, the Vorkai directness, the flat attention they gave to anything they decided was worth their full focus, layered over something they had absorbed from 2 years on Selim 7, from the people who had built them climbing frames and calibrated their food and argued about incline angles and read to them when they were too small to read themselves. They covered each other the way the crew covered each other. They brought things to people who were struggling. They kept going when it would have been easier to stop. I did not know exactly when I understood that these were not behaviors we had taught them in any formal sense. They had watched us. They had decided independently that this was how things should be done. They had made it their own. The Vorkai clan elder delegation arrived in the 25th month. I had been expecting it since Heron Vox's visit. The channel back to the clan council had been active, quiet, but active, and the developmental data I had shared through official compact channels had apparently generated significant internal debate. The delegation was 3 people, a senior elder named Varthan, a junior diplomatic aide whose name I recorded as Pol Sarek, and a military assessor named Okendal, whose presence told me everything I needed to know about what the clan council was actually interested in. They arrived in the morning, and I brought them to the habitat bay, and I watched them watch the 6. The reaction moved through 3 stages, which I observed carefully. The first stage was contempt. I could see it in the way Var then held his crest feathers when we entered, fully upright, the dominance position, a communication that these were lower creatures, and this space was beneath his attention. Okendal's eyes moved over the 6 with the practiced efficiency of a military assessor, and the slight downward shift of his crest told me his initial evaluation matched what the pod log had predicted. Small, atypical, not worth the resource expenditure. The second stage was confusion. It came on gradually, beginning with Core. Core was working through a conditioning sequence with Pete, and the sequence had evolved significantly since those first simple exercises 2 years ago. What Core was doing now was not simple. It was precise and demanding, and it was being done with a quality of focus that made Oak and Dal stop scanning the room and look at just that one thing for a long, quiet moment. Varthan's crest feathers lowered slightly from their upright position. Not all the way, but enough that I noticed. Then Six came into the bay carrying her tablet, sat down cross-legged against the far wall, and opened a text in Galactic Standard, which is one of the more complex human languages in the compact library, and began reading. Pol Sarek, the aide, followed her with his eyes for a full minute. Then Ren and Owen had a discussion about the results of Kerr's latest mobility assessment that lasted 12 minutes and involved vocabulary that I was fairly certain Pol Sarek did not follow despite being a trained diplomat. The third stage was a very careful, very controlled version of alarm. Varthan came to stand beside me near the bay entrance. His crest feathers were now in the neutral position, held flat, which in a Vorkai elder I had come to understand as the deliberate suppression of whatever the crest feathers actually wanted to do. These are the units jettisoned to Kaith, he said. Yes, they are operating above compact benchmarks for their age group. Significantly above, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Okendal had moved closer to where Pete and Core were working, and Pete had not asked him to step back, which surprised me until I realized Pete had registered Okendal as another military person and had opened up the space accordingly, without thinking about it. The Clan Council has determined that these individuals have demonstrated viability under compact legal definition, Varthan said. They are therefore subject to Vorkai clan authority as birth-registered citizens. I had been waiting for some version of this. I had thought about what to say. In the end, I chose not to say anything myself. Six, I said instead. She looked up from her tablet. The Elder would like to address all 6 of you, I said. She looked at Varthan. Her crest feathers moved into the position I had come to read as careful attention. Fully forward, slightly compressed, the look she got when she was about to evaluate something she was not sure she trusted. We will hear him, she said, in Galactic Standard. Perfectly. Varthan spoke to them in Vorkai. He explained, in formal clan language, that the Council recognized their viability and their citizen status, and that it was the Council's decision that they would be returned to Vorkai society to complete their development under proper clan oversight. He finished. There was silence. Six was the one who responded, and she responded in Galactic Standard, not in Vorkai, and I believe that was a deliberate choice. You left us, she said. You decided we were not worth keeping. You put us in a pod and sent us into a debris field and kept flying. She looked at Varthan without any visible emotion, her crest feathers still in that forward, compressed position. These people did not leave. They found us in the dark, and they brought us in, and they stayed. Every day, when it was hard and expensive and complicated, they stayed. She paused. You have authority under compact law. I understand this. But you will need to explain to me why I should consider your authority meaningful, given the last decision you made about us. It was the first time in recorded compact history, to my knowledge, that a Vorkai cub had formally refused a clan directive to their face. I know this because Pol Sarek told me afterward, in a quiet, slightly dazed voice, that he had just witnessed something he was not sure the legal frameworks had a category for. Varthan's crest feathers went very still. He looked at Six for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I looked back at him and said nothing because it was not my conversation. Six had made that clear. That night, I sat alone in the medical bay and wrote in my log. I wrote down what Six had said, exactly as she had said it, because I wanted to have it right. Then I sat for a while and thought about what I had actually made in the last 2 years. I had set out to keep 6 cubs alive. I had kept 6 cubs alive. But somewhere between the creche pod and this evening, the 6 of them had become people, specific, particular, unrepeatable people, and people make their own decisions. They were not mine. They never had been. They were their own, and they had been their own for longer than I had properly understood, and the moment I placed with the most precision was Kerr's 11-meter walk across the habitat bay. The morning he looked back and saw what he had done, and his crest feathers went straight up. That was when Kerr became Kerr, fully and entirely. I wrote that down too. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. I have been asked, since the events of that night, Why did not evacuate to the secured section of the station when the alert first sounded? I have a simple answer, which is that the secured section was on the opposite side of the station from the habitat bay, and the habitat bay was where the six were. There's no more complex answer than that. The Kethari Raider group that hit Selam 7 was a mid-range swarm, 11 ships, fast and lightly armed, built for opportunistic strikes on frontier stations that were too far from defense corridors to receive quick backup. They were not an elite force. They did not need to be. Selam 7 was a research and rescue station with a skeleton crew on night rotation, 2 defensive gun emplacements, and backup response from the nearest compact patrol unit at 4 hours out. The math was not complicated. On any normal night, they would have been right. The alert came at 0140. I was asleep. I was awake and moving within 8 seconds, which is something I'm not particularly proud of. I have trained myself to move fast on alerts, but 8 seconds still felt too slow once I was in the corridor and could hear what was happening. The station's first defensive emplacement was offline within 2 minutes of the alert. A focused hit on the power relay, deliberate and precise, which told me they had done reconnaissance. The second emplacement was still active, but down to 40% capacity. Commander Adler's voice came over the station-wide comm. All non-combat personnel to secure sections. Repeat, all non-combat personnel to secure sections immediately. I ran toward the habitat bay. I met 6 in the corridor outside it. She was already moving. All 6 of them were already moving, and she had a look on her face that I had never seen before, which was the complete absence of anything that was not focus. Her crest feathers were flat against her skull in the position I now knew meant total concentration. How many? She said. 11 ships. First emplacement is down. She processed this in less than a second. We need the docking corridor, she said. That is the entry point with the structural advantage. She was right. The docking corridor was the only approach with enough natural choke points to make a smaller defensive force meaningful against a numerically superior one. I had not consciously worked that out yet. She already had. 6, I said. She looked at me. Be careful, I said, which I knew was inadequate, and said it anyway. Her crest feathers moved forward the careful attention position, and then she turned and said something to the other 5 in rapid Vorkai that I only partially caught, and they moved. What happened in the docking corridor over the next 4 hours, I can tell you from the station's internal recordings, which I reviewed 17 times over the following week. I was not present for most of it. I was in the medical bay with Owen, preparing for incoming casualties, which proved necessary. What the recordings show is this: 6 Vorkai young adults, none of them yet 3 years into their development from near-death starvation cases, held the primary docking corridor against the boarding teams from 3 Kethari ships for 4 hours and 11 minutes. They did not do it the way Vorkai warriors are trained to do it. Vorkai warrior doctrine in a corridor situation is aggressive and frontal. Press the advantage, show dominance, make the cost of advancing too high. That doctrine is effective. It is also predictable, and the Kethari had faced Vorkai warrior units before. The 6 did not fight like Vorkai warriors. They fought like something the Kethari had no category for. They covered each other. When one of them moved forward, 2 others repositioned to cover the retreat. When Kor held the front position, Galt was watching the secondary access point that Kor could not see from where he was standing, and when that access point was used, Galt was already there. They rotated positions without verbal signals in a pattern that shifted constantly, and the Kethari boarding teams, who had expected either the predictable Vorkai front press or the chaotic scramble of untrained station crew, kept hitting neither. Ren kept giving information. Factual, precise, continuous, position reports, pattern analysis, resource assessments. She was doing in real time what she had been doing for 2 years in Owen's medical bay, reading a situation and saying what she saw without the filter of panic. Ren was the one who kept Kerr moving. Kerr's spinal condition meant his stamina had limits that the others did not have, and Ren knew his cycle, knew when he was near the edge, knew how to reposition him into a supporting role for the 10 minutes he needed before he was ready to go forward again, and she managed this without ever taking her own attention fully off the corridor. Six coordinated everything. I watched her in the recordings, and I still cannot entirely explain how she did it, except to say that she seemed to be processing the entire corridor at once. Not as individual moments, but as a continuous pattern, and her decisions were consistently 10 to 15 seconds ahead of what the situation was visibly demanding at any given moment. She had learned this from watching humans, I believe. From watching Owen read a medical situation. From watching Dex navigate through debris fields. From watching Pete work with Core. She had absorbed the way humans look at a problem, not just at what is happening, but at what is about to happen. And she had added it to everything that was already Vorkai in her, and the result was something that had no name in any tactical manual I have read. At hour 3, the Vorkai elder delegation entered the corridor. Var then had apparently decided that the situation required his presence at the front rather than in the secured section. I will give him that. He came with Okendao, and what Okendao saw in those first minutes in the corridor, the 6 of them in motion, the system they had built, the quality of what was happening. I watched Okendao's face on the recording, and I can tell you that the military assessor from the clan council did not look contemptuous anymore. He looked like a man doing very rapid math. The moment I have replayed the most is near the end of hour 3. A Kethari forward team broke through a side access and got within 15 meters of Var then's position before the corridor security caught up with it. The team was fast, and they were armed, and Var then was a diplomat and an elder, not a fighter. 6 was between them and him before the access breach was 12 seconds old. She did not fight the team alone. Kerr came in from the left, Galt from the right, in a triangular coverage pattern that closed the approach and made it untenable. The team pulled back. The access was sealed. 15 seconds, start to finish. Var then looked at 6. She was already looking back the way she had come, reassessing the corridor. He said in Vorkai, why? She answered in Galactic Standard. The same choice as before, and I believe for the same reason. Because that is what you do with people who cannot protect themselves, she said. You protect them. She did not look at him when she said it. She was already scanning the corridor for the next movement. Var then stood very still for a long time. The compact patrol unit arrived at 4 hours and 16 minutes. The Kethari force, having failed to take the station through the primary approach, had already begun withdrawal. They were intercepted by the patrol unit 40 minutes later. Of the 11 ships, 4 taken. The rest scattered. Commander Adler filed his after-action report the following morning. I have a copy. In the section on station defense, he wrote, primary corridor held by 6 Sealam 7 residents, identified in this report as the Sealam-raised individuals designated in prior compact registry filings. Casualties among defending party. Kerr, spinal strain consistent with overextension, treated and recovering. No fatalities. Station integrity maintained. I read that report, and then I went to the Habitat Bay, and I sat with all 6 of them for a while. Kerr was lying down with a cold pack on his back and telling anyone who would listen that he was fine, and Ren was monitoring his readings and telling him his definition of fine needed review. And 6 was sitting against the far wall reading her journal, not adding to it, just reading what was already there. She looked up when I sat down near her. Her crest feathers were in the quiet position, settled, even. The position I associated with the end of a hard day when things had gone as well as they were going to go. Are you all right? I asked. Yes, she said. Are they? She looked at the other 5. Galt was asleep already. Ren had found a piece of scrap material and was making something with it, as she always did when she needed to settle. Core and Pete were sitting in silence across the room from each other in the way they sometimes did after a hard session, not needing to say anything. They are, 6 said. Good, I said. She went back to reading. I stayed where I was, and the Habitat Bay was quiet around us, and outside the station the debris field drifted in the dark, and somewhere in it, very far away, was the place I found a creche pod with a flat beacon and a log entry about non-recoverable weight, and I sat with the distance between that place and this one for a long time before I finally went to bed. The compact council chamber holds 400 observers. When I walked to the center podium in the 3rd month after the Sealam 7 incident, every seat was occupied, which had not happened in a standard policy session in 11 years. I know this because the clerk told me on the way in in the offhand tone of someone sharing a piece of trivia, and I noted it the same way I note everything, as a data point, nothing more. I had been summoned to explain myself. The formal language of the summons said, to provide testimony regarding the unauthorized care and development of 6 Vorkai biological units and the subsequent implications for compact multi-species policy. I had read it twice, decided it was accurate enough, and spent 3 weeks preparing. I was not nervous. I want to be clear about that. I had sat in a debris field at 0300 and found 6 cubs that no one had planned to save. I had argued with compact bureaucracy for 2 years while running a recovery program on Frontier Station resources. I had spent one night in a medical bay preparing for casualties while 6 people I had pulled out of the dark held a corridor against a raider force for over 4 hours. A council chamber full of people in good seats did not particularly move me. I submitted my data first. This was a deliberate choice. Before I said a single word, I transmitted the full developmental record, every measurement, every assessment, every treatment log, every outcome chart, to the Council's shared data system. I wanted them to have the numbers before they had my words, because numbers do not editorialize, and I did not want them to be able to say later that I had framed the data to suit an argument. Then I spoke. I told them what I had found in the Caith Expanse. I told them what the podlog said. I told them what condition the cubs were in when we retrieved them, and I told them what condition they were in now. I used the clinical language I always use because clinical language is honest in a particular way. It describes what happened without asking you to feel a specific thing about it. And I've always believed that if the facts are presented clearly, the feeling follows on its own. I did not moralize. I had decided against moralizing very specifically because I did not think it was my job to tell a chamber full of multi-species representatives what they should value. I thought it was my job to tell them what I had done and what had resulted from it. When I finished the primary testimony, the council chair, a Preethian named Voss Irin, who had held the position for 12 years and whose reputation was for asking the question no one else in the room had worked out yet, looked at me for a moment and then said, "Dr. Voss, I have one question, and I want you to answer it directly." "Yes," I said. "Why do humans do this?" He paused. "Not this specific case. The pattern. We have record from 6 other species in the compact of humans intervening to sustain individuals that those species had already classified as non-viable. 4 of those cases predate your assignment to Selim 7. The pattern is older than you. My question is not about the policy. My question is about the impulse. Why do humans specifically and repeatedly do this?" The chamber was very quiet. I thought about the question for a moment. I thought about what the real answer was, and whether the real answer was one I could say in a council chamber to 400 observers, and I decided that it was. "We used to do what you do," I said. "Many human cultures, across many centuries, identified the individuals who did not meet a viable threshold and let them go. We had very efficient systems for it. The logic was always the same: limited resources, survival of the group, the cost of sustaining one against the benefit of preserving many." I paused. We stopped. Not all at once, and not without argument. But over time we stopped, and we started asking a different question. Not, can this individual survive? But, what is this individual going to become if we do not let them stop? I stopped and looked at the chamber. "And then we became who we are now," I said, "which is a species that found 6 cubs in a debris field at 3 in the morning and brought them home." The silence went on for a moment. Then a dozen voices started at once, and Voss Irin called the chamber back to order, and the testimony continued. 6 testified after me. She had dressed, if that is the right word, with the same precision she brought to everything. Crest feathers in the neutral position, spine straight, her tablet in one arm in case she needed to reference anything. She did not need to reference anything. A council representative from the Vorkai clan, not Varthen, a more senior elder named Har Vosketh, who had been sent specifically for this session, asked her to identify herself for the council record. She said, "I am 6. I am Selim raised." There was a pause. "Could you be more specific regarding species classification?" the representative asked. "I could," 6 said, "but I do not think the category you are asking for exists yet." She held the elder's gaze. You're asking whether I am Vorkai or whether I am something shaped by humans. The answer is that I am both, and I am neither, and the compact does not have a word for what I am. I suggest the compact develop one. Pol Sarek, who was present as part of the Vorkai diplomatic attendance, made a sound. I'm fairly sure it was a very controlled attempt not to laugh. The session went on for 6 hours. There were arguments about jurisdiction and about the legal status of the Six under compact citizen law and about what precisely the Frontier Rescue Corps' mandate covered and did not cover. There were arguments about resource allocation and about precedent and about what the data from the development record actually implied for compact policy on non-viable classification systems. Harvas Keth argued that the Vorkai clan's authority over its citizens remained unchanged regardless of the developmental circumstances. A Preethian representative argued that the developmental record constituted a compact research asset and that the Six should be reclassified under research subject protections. Six sat through all of it with her crest feathers in the neutral position and her tablet untouched. She had heard what she needed to hear. When they asked her questions, she answered them precisely. When they did not ask her questions, she watched. At the end of the session, the council issued a temporary ruling. The Six were to be recognized as individuals of unique categorical status, pending the development of a formal compact legal framework for multi-origin citizens. Their residence at Selam 7 was confirmed pending their own choice of domicile, which would be recognized as legally binding once the framework was completed. It was not a perfect outcome. It was a real one, which is different, and I had learned to distinguish between the two. The 6 of them were waiting at the docking port when I returned to Selam 7 4 days later. All 6. They had been there, Dex told me later, for about 40 minutes before my ship came in, which was information I received, and then had to walk to the far end of the docking bay for a moment before I came back and said hello. The thing about the 6 of them was this. They had built something. Not a program, not a place, not a plan. They had built a way of being in the world, a specific, particular way that was entirely their own and that had come from something I had not designed and could not have designed because it had arisen from them making their own decisions in response to the people around them. They covered each other. They brought things to people who were struggling. They stayed when it would have been easier to leave. They held the corridor because no one else was going to. I had not taught them any of these things. Or rather, I had not taught any of these things in any formal sense. We had just lived the way we lived on Selam 7, and they had watched and decided. Var then requested a private meeting before he left for the Vorkai clan homeworld. We met in the station's small conference room, just the 2 of us. His crest feathers were in a position I had not seen from him before, slightly forward, slightly down, the position I associated in younger Vorkai with what you might call careful reflection. I have submitted a supplementary report to the clan council, he said, beyond my official testimony. I see, I said. I recommended a review of the classification protocols, he said. The specific criteria used to assess developmental viability at the embryonic stage. I noted that the criteria were developed without accounting for the possibility of external intervention of the type documented in your developmental record. I looked at him. You were saying the criteria were designed assuming that non-viable meant terminally non-viable, I said. Without a category for non-viable given current Vorkai resources, but viable under different conditions. Yes, he said. That is what I am saying. We were quiet for a moment. Will the council review it? I asked. I believe so, he said. Okendal has submitted a separate report focused on the tactical assessments from the docking corridor incident. The combination of the 2 has created a situation the council cannot easily dismiss. Good, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, in the careful, formal Vorkai phrasing that I had come to understand as the closest thing in their language to sincerity, I would not have chosen the decision that was made in the Kaith Expanse. But I would not have thought to make a different decision, either. I would not have had the framework to imagine this outcome. No, I said. Neither would I once. It took us a long time. How long? I thought about it. Longer than we should be proud of, I said. But we got there. He nodded. His crest feathers settled. Then he left, and I went back to the Habitat Bay. 3 months after the council session, I received a request from a species called the Wrath, whose territory bordered the outer compact edge, regarding 4 biological units currently listed in their population records under a status that translated approximately as unfit for continuation. The request asked whether the Frontier Rescue Corps had capacity and expertise for non-standard developmental cases. I looked at the request for a while. Then I called Dex into the office. "What do you think?" I said. He read the request. Then he said, "I will check the ship." "I already started the supply list," I said. "Tell Nina to double the nutrition stores." He stopped at the door. "What kind of species are the Wrath?" "I do not know yet," I said. "I will learn." He nodded and left. I turned back to my console and began filing the response. The beacon on my secondary screen was quiet. The debris fields of the Caith Expanse were 400 million kilometers away. In the habitat bay, 6 was reading. Kerr was doing his mobility sequence on a new frame Cal had built in the expanded space. Core and Pete were running their morning session. Galt was in the corner watching all of it in the way he always did, missing nothing. I wrote in my log before I sent the response. The entry was short. New case incoming. For units, Wrath species, classification, unfit for continuation. Resources available. Crew notified. Cook has been told to double stores. He did not ask why. He knows us by now. I sent the response, logged the new case, and went to find Owen to start reading whatever the compact xenobiology library had on Wrath developmental biology. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That is the thing about deciding that the ceiling is not fixed. Once you make that decision, truly make it, the work does not end. It just changes shape. Each new case is its own problem, its own set of obstacles, its own series of days when the progress is too slow and the resources are too thin and the system you're working within does not have a category for what you are doing. Each one requires you to start from the beginning and find the answer the same way you always find it, which is by refusing to stop looking. I've been asked if I think what I did on Coelum 7 was exceptional. I have been asked this in council chambers and in academic correspondence, and in an informal way that people ask things when they're standing next to you in a corridor and they do not have a better moment to ask. My answer is always the same. I found a beacon. I followed it. I found 6 cubs that someone had decided were not worth the effort, and I disagreed, and I brought them home, and the people around me helped, and 2 years later those 6 cubs held a corridor for 4 hours because they had learned from watching us that you do not leave the people who cannot protect themselves. That is not exceptional. That is just what happens when you refuse to accept that some things cannot be saved. We learned that the hard way. We took too long to learn it, but we learned it, and now we carry it with us wherever we go, out to the edges of the compact and into the debris fields and toward every flat, steady beacon that no one else has thought to follow. 6 is still keeping her journal. Last week she showed me an entry, just one passage, without explanation. It described the moment in the council chamber when she had said she was coelum raised and the pause that had followed and what the pause had felt like from where she was standing. She wrote, "I did not feel uncertain. I felt precise. I knew exactly what I was, even though the word did not exist yet. I thought the word will catch up. Words always catch up eventually. People make them when they need them." I read it twice. Then I gave the tablet back to her and did not say anything because there was nothing I could add to that. She already knew.
Say I'm bored. Kick out. Kick. Bored. Sorry. One more. You got me.